New digital scan of the Titanic has offered an unprecedented insight into the ship's final moments.
On September 1st, 1985, the Titanic appeared again after 73 years in darkness. Almost 2.5 miles below the Atlantic, its bow came into view, still shaped like the mighty ship the world remembered. But the discovery did not stay beautiful for long. About 2,000 feet away, the back half was a mangled wreck of torn steel and collapsed decks, almost impossible to recognize as the same ship. The accepted explanation is that brutal natural forces crushed it as it sank. But that only explains the damage. The real reason almost no one talks about Titanic's back half is far more complex and disturbing. The official story of Titanic's ending. When the Titanic went down in April 1912, the world did not treat it like an ordinary accident at sea. It was too big, too famous, and too full of people who had trusted it. The ship had left Southampton as a symbol of power. Days later, it was gone, and more than 1,500 people were dead in the North Atlantic. Part of the shock came from the sheer size of what had just vanished. The Titanic was about 882 feet and 9 inches long, longer than 2.5 football fields. It was about 92 feet and 6 inches wide, with enough space inside for grand rooms, long corridors, cargo holds, crew areas, engine rooms, and huge passenger decks stacked above the sea. The ship stood about 175 feet from the keel to the top of the funnels. It weighed more than 46,000 gross tons. Deep inside, 29 boilers and 159 coal-burning furnaces helped power the giant across the Atlantic. This was not a fragile little vessel lost in a storm. It was one of the largest moving objects people had ever trusted on water, carrying more than 2,200 passengers and crew on its first crossing. That was why the disaster felt impossible. Families wanted names, newspapers wanted answers, governments wanted to know how a brand new liner could disappear on its first voyage. The questions were simple, but terrifying. Why was the ship moving through ice? Why were there not enough lifeboats for everyone? Why did the warning signs fail to stop it? And in those final minutes, what actually happened to the ship itself? America moved first. On April 17, 1912, the United States Senate approved an investigation into the disaster. 2 days later, on April 19th, the hearings opened at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. That was only 1 day after the rescue ship Carpathia reached New York with the survivors. People who had just escaped the sinking were suddenly facing questions from senators. The inquiry was led by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan. He wanted testimony before passengers and crew scattered across the world. The hearings later moved to Washington, where the questioning continued. By the end, 82 witnesses had testified. The record grew to more than 1,100 pages. The senators asked about every part of the disaster. They asked about ice warnings. They asked about the ship's speed. They asked why the lifeboats were not filled to safe capacity. They asked why nearby ships did not reach the Titanic sooner. They asked whether first class, second class, and third class passengers had been treated differently. Across the Atlantic, Britain began its own investigation. The British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry opened in May 1912, led by Lord Mersey. It looked at the ship's route, the ice messages, the speed, the lifeboats, the rescue, the role of the Californian, and the safety rules that had allowed Titanic to sail with lifeboats for only part of the people on board. By the end of July, the British report gave its main finding. The Titanic had been lost because it struck an iceberg while traveling too fast for the ice conditions. That answer became the heart of the public story. The ship met ice, the front flooded, the bows sank lower, the stern rose higher, and then the whole vessel slipped beneath the surface. The official reports treated the ship as if it sank in one piece. The American report did admit that people disagreed about whether the Titanic broke apart, but it said the strongest evidence showed the ship sank almost vertically and in one piece. The British report was even clearer. It said the ship did not break in two. It described the stern rising, the propellers coming clear of the water, the ship reaching a steep angle, and then sinking. That conclusion shaped Titanic's story for decades. In the clean version, there was no separate mystery of the back half. At the time, That was easier to accept than it sounds now. No one had photographs of the wreck. The final moments had happened in darkness. The ship's lights were fading. People were in lifeboats, in the water, or fighting to stay alive. Some were close enough to hear terrifying sounds. Others were far enough away to see only a great black shape against a darker sea. It was not a calm scene where anyone could study the ship carefully. It was panic, cold, noise, and death. But some survivors remembered a much rougher and more violent ending. Their accounts did not fit the clean official story. The survivors who remembered a different ending. One of the most important voices was Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old first-class passenger. He had been traveling with his parents, but by the end of the night, he was fighting for his life in the sea. He survived by reaching the overturned collapsible B, one of the last lifeboats swept into the water. From that desperate position, he later described Titanic's final moments as far more violent than a smooth plunge. He remembered the ship under terrible strain. He remembered the structure bending and breaking. He remembered the back of the ship rising, then the shape of the Titanic changing before it disappeared. Another strong voice was George Simons, one of the Titanic's lookouts. He was not a confused passenger seeing the sea for the first time. He was an experienced seaman who had spent nearly 9 years at sea and had crossed the Atlantic roughly 58 to 60 times. Earlier that night, he had worked in the crow's nest before being relieved at 10 o'clock. After the collision, he helped with the boats and ended up in command of Lifeboat 1, watching Titanic from hundreds of yards away. Simon saw the stern lift high out of the water. He saw the ship's lights disappear. Then he watched the back end right itself, in a way that did not match a whole ship going down together. To him, the stern appeared to rise and move without the bow. His conclusion was simple: the Titanic must have broken in half. Other survivors carried similar memories. Some spoke of a huge crash. Some remembered a deep roar. Some heard a sound like heavy iron tearing or falling through the ship. In lifeboats, people looked back and saw a giant black shape lifting into the air, then changing in a way that did not feel natural. To them, the Titanic did not simply slide away. Something happened before the sea took it. But there was another side to the story. Charles Lytler, Titanic's second officer, was the highest-ranking officer to survive. His words carried real weight because he had helped load boats, followed orders on deck, and lived through the final collapse near the ship itself. Lytler believed the Titanic had gone down intact. He did not support the idea that the hull had fully separated at the surface. To investigators looking for the strongest account, his rank made his version powerful. For decades, the people who remembered a violent ending had only their words. They could describe what they saw. But the official record had already chosen the cleaner version. For more than 70 years, those memories had nothing solid to stand on. Then, a deep-sea camera found an answer. The search for Titanic. For more than 7 decades, the actual ship remained out of reach, resting in a place no one could reach. The problem was the ocean itself. Titanic lay about 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. That is not just deep water. That is a cold, black world where sunlight never reaches. Pressure is crushing, and a human diver has no chance. By the 1980s, the technology had finally caught up with the dream. A joint French and American effort brought together the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and IFREMER, the French Ocean Research Group. The search was led by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel. The team had narrowed the possible area to about 100 square miles. That sounds precise until you remember what they were looking for. The Titanic was huge, but the Atlantic was far bigger. The search area was dark, flat, and almost endless on the screens. Hour after hour, the seafloor could look the same. Mud, emptiness, more silence. The plan came in 2 stages. First, the French vessel Le Suroît used a deep-towed sonar system called SAR. It moved across the search zone in long lines, looking for shapes on the ocean floor. Sonar could cover space, but it had a weakness. The seabed can hide wreckage in plain sight. A strange shape might be a rock. A small object might mean nothing. A broken piece of history might look like another bump in the mud. Then came the American research vessel, Cunard, carrying Argo. Argo was a deep-towed camera system, pulled above the ocean floor, while the team watched the live images from the ship above. If sonar was the wide search, Argo was the close look. It did not just hunt for a large outline, it searched for proof that human hands had built something there. That difference mattered. The old story had trained the world to think of a ship that sank whole, so the most natural hope was to find a grand shape lying in the mud. A bow, a deck, a hull, something clearly ship-like. But the ocean did not give the team that kind of first answer. It gave them fragments. The search dragged on through long hours of watching screens. Then, in the early hours of September 1st, 1985, something changed. The screen showed wreckage that did not belong to the natural world. It was man-made. Then came the object that made the moment impossible to dismiss. One of Titanic's boilers. A boiler was not a small passenger item that could have drifted away. It was part of the ship's power system, a massive piece of machinery from deep inside the vessel. Titanic had carried 29 boilers, and seeing one alone on the seafloor was a huge clue. It meant the team had reached the ship's grave. But the boiler also said something troubling. If the Titanic had been lying in one neat piece, the first clear sign might have been the hull itself. Soon, more pieces appeared. The ocean was showing them a trail of wreckage, and that trail led toward the truth the old reports had missed. The discovery that exposed the truth. The pieces led them through the darkness one by one. Metal, coal, broken parts from inside the ship. Objects that had once been hidden behind walls, floors, and steel plates were now lying open on the seabed. Then the shape everyone had been waiting for finally appeared. Out of the black water came the bow. Even after decades under the sea, even after striking the bottom, the front of the Titanic was still recognizable. The bow still had the look of a ship. It still had the sharp forward shape that once cut through the Atlantic. The railings, the anchors, the broken mast, and the stretched deck lines all gave the mind something to understand. For the people watching the images from above, that moment carried the force of history. A ship that had disappeared in 1912 had been seen again in 1985. The front half was damaged, rusted, and buried in places, but it still looked like the liner the world had searched for. But the bow created an immediate problem. The Titanic had not been a small ship. It had stretched about 882 feet and 9 inches from front to back, with a width of about 92 feet and 6 inches. It had carried more than 2,000 people on its maiden voyage. It had been built with decks, engines, cabins, cargo spaces, funnels, and great rooms spread across a... Finding the bow did not answer where the rest of that giant had gone. If this was the front of the Titanic, then where was the back? The answer was not sitting beside it. The team kept moving across the seabed, away from the bow and back into the debris. Then the back half appeared. It was about 2,000 feet from the bow, separated from it by a wide stretch of wreckage. At first glance, it did not feel like the same ship. The bow was broken but readable. The stern was chaos. The back half had collapsed into a crushed mass of steel. Decks that once sat above one another were no longer clean layers. Hull plates were torn, bent, and thrown out of shape. The stern did not look like a famous liner resting in the deep. It looked like the disaster had twisted everything it touched. The stern did not simply add detail to the story. It changed the story. Its location proved that the Titanic had not reached the bottom as one complete vessel. The ship had broken apart before the two main sections came to rest far from each other. The official version that had lasted for decades could no longer stand. The broken stern gave power to the memories that had once sounded too messy to accept. The survivors who remembered a violent ending had not been inventing a fantasy. The wreck itself now showed that Titanic's final moments had been far rougher than the clean story allowed. Finding the stern answered the biggest question from the old argument. The Titanic did break apart, but it also created a new and darker question. Why did the back half look so much worse than the front? The violent end of Titanic's back half. The bow and the stern did not reach the ocean floor the same way. That is why one half still looks like a ship, while the other looks like it was torn apart and crushed into itself. The bow had already taken in huge amounts of water before the final plunge. By the time it broke free and started falling through the deep, it was heavy, flooded, and pointed downward. It still hit the bottom with terrible force, but it moved more like the front of a ship cutting through water. Its shape helped it hold together enough to remain recognizable. The stern had a much worse journey. This was not a small, loose piece snapping away from the ship. The stern was still a giant rear section packed with engines, shafts, rooms, decks, and heavy steel. Once it separated, all that weight had to move through the water without the long front section that had once balanced it. The back half became its own falling disaster. Nothing about that fall was gentle, straight, or easy for the structure to survive. When the Titanic split, the back half was already damaged. The break had opened its front end, exposed inner spaces, and put sudden strain on decks, rooms, machinery areas, and steel plates. It was no longer the strong rear of a great liner. It was a broken shell, still partly full of air, with the sea rushing into it from places that had never been meant to open. That was the first blow. The second came as the stern sank deeper. Near the surface, air trapped inside the back half still had space to hold out for a short time, but the deeper it fell, the harder the water pressed against it. The stern was being squeezed from every side. Spaces that still held air could not stay open forever. As the pressure grew, those spaces gave way. Walls buckled, decks collapsed, openings widened. Parts of the stern were not just sinking, they were being crushed while they sank. This is one of the biggest reasons the back half looks so different from the bow. The bow had filled with water earlier, so the pressure inside and outside became more even as it went down. Then came the third blow, the fall itself. The stern did not glide down in a calm line. It was damaged, unbalanced, and full of moving water and air. As it dropped through the black water, it twisted and fell in a violent path. Heavy parts shifted, broken steel pulled in different directions. When it finally struck the ocean floor, the damage got worse. The stern slammed down with so much force that the decks crushed into one another. Floors that had once been separated by rooms and passageways collapsed downward. Instead of standing in clean layers, they were pushed together, like several floors of a building falling into the same pile. It did not just lie down, it folded into itself. The hull plates also lost their shape. Some were bent outward, some were torn open, some were thrown into a twisted mass around the wreck. The engines and other heavy parts helped turn the inside into a jumble. There is also a deeper question under all of this. Why did the ship give way in the first place? The answer is not as simple as saying the Titanic was badly built. It was an advanced ship for its time, made by skilled workers in one of the great shipyards of the age. But it was still built with the materials, methods, and confidence of the early 1900s. Later tests on recovered steel showed that the metal could become brittle in ice-cold seawater. Tests on some recovered rivets also found high levels of slag, a glassy waste material left from iron making. Too much slag can make iron weaker under stress. That does not mean one bad rivet sank the Titanic. It means the ship was not a magic machine. It had limits. Its steel, its rivets, its size, and its design all belong to a time when builders believed they had made something stronger. Modern scans have made that clearer. In 2023, researchers created the first full-size digital scan of the Titanic wreck. 2 remotely operated submersibles spent 6 weeks mapping the site in great detail. The work produced about 715,000 images and captured the wreck and the surrounding 3-mile debris field with a level of detail that earlier explorers never had. The scan revealed a very sad truth. In the wreck, researchers found a steam valve left open. An open valve suggests that steam was still being sent through the ship's power system late in the sinking. That supports the long-held account that Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and the men below deck kept working after the iceberg strike, trying to hold power on the ship for as long as possible. The lights helped people move through the decks, helped the lifeboat work continue in the dark, and helped the wireless room keep sending. Distress calls. None of the Titanic's engineers survived. Titanic is still falling apart. The stern not only suffered the worst fall, it is now living through the worst afterlife. Titanic is not sitting in the deep like a museum piece sealed away from time. It is still changing. It is still weakening. It is still being pulled apart, little by little, in a place where almost no human can reach it. The sinking ended in 1912, but the ocean never stopped working. Salt water keeps attacking the steel. Deep currents move across the wreck site. The cold does not protect the ship the way many people might think. Down there, the sea is slow, but it is never still. It pushes, eats, loosens, and wears down what is left. The same ship that once crossed the Atlantic with huge engines and glowing lights is now being broken down by water, pressure, rust, and living things too small to see. The clearest sign of that slow death hangs from the wreck like dirty brown icicles. They are called rusticles. At first, they look like ordinary rust dripping off the metal, but they are not just dead flakes of decay. They are living growths packed with tiny organisms. These organisms have made the Titanic part of their world. They feed on the iron in the ship and help turn solid steel into weak, crumbling material. In 2010, scientists formally described a new kind of bacterium taken from the Titanic's rusticles. They named it Halomonas titanici, after the ship itself. That name sounds almost respectful, but what it does to the wreck is brutal. It helps eat away at the iron and leaves behind rust that can break loose and fall. Piece by piece, the ship is being turned back into the ocean. That is especially bad news for the stern. The bow is decaying too, but the stern entered this long afterlife already shattered. It had been torn open, crushed, twisted, and folded into itself before the sea even began its slow work. That means the back half has more broken edges, more exposed spaces, more ripped steel, and more weak points for the ocean to attack. The wreck's slow collapse can be seen in famous areas that people once thought would stay almost unchanged. By 2019, explorers were already seeing major decay around the officers' quarters. One of the most famous spots connected to Captain Edward Smith's cabin had changed so badly that the old image people remembered was no longer the same. Then came an even clearer sign in 2024. A large section of the bow's famous portside railing had broken away and fallen to the mud below. That railing was one of the most well-known parts of the entire wreck. That loss proves that nothing on the ship should be treated as permanent anymore. In 2024, another expedition also gathered more than 2 million images of the site, using uncrewed vehicles to study the wreck without sending people down inside it. That work is important because every new record may capture details that will not be there the next time. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.